Trans woman rejected for being different, then becomes the town's new judge. How will this story escalate? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The fluorescent lights in the grocery store hummed softly, casting a sterile glow over the aisles. It was supposed to be a routine stop, just a quick run for some essentials before heading home. But as she reached for a box of tea from the shelf, she felt it. That familiar weight. The feeling of eyes on her. She turned slowly, expecting it to be her imagination. It wasn't. A store employee stood a few feet away, arms crossed, their expression unreadable at first. But then, with a slow tilt of the head, their lips curled into something unmistakable: disapproval. "Can I help you with something?" the worker asked, their voice sharp. She straightened her back. "No, I'm fine, thanks." The worker didn't move. "You sure? Just making sure you're in the right place." There was the edge, the implication. She took a steady breath. She had dealt with this before. Too many times. "I know where I am," she said evenly. The worker's eyes flickered up and down, scanning her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Just checking," they muttered before turning and walking away. She exhaled slowly, willing her heart to slow down. She had learned to expect these moments, but that didn't make them easier. People like her weren't always welcome. She grabbed the tea and headed toward the checkout, hoping that was the end of it. But as she placed her items on the counter, she noticed the cashier, a different employee this time, whispering something to a colleague. They glanced at her, then laughed. Her stomach tightened. The cashier straightened, forcing a customer service smile. "Did you find everything you needed?" She kept her voice calm. "I did." They scanned her items in silence, but she could feel the judgment. It was in the way they avoided eye contact, in the stiffness of their movements, in the way their mouth twitched as if they were biting back something cruel. She had a choice. She could say something, call them out, demand respect. But she was tired. So tired. She swiped her card, grabbed the bag, and walked out without another word. But the weight of it followed her. She had lived in this town for years. She had built a life here. And yet, moments like these reminded her that she would never be seen the same way. Not by them. Not yet. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that change was coming. And soon, they would have no choice but to see her differently. Because whether they liked it or not, she was about to become the most powerful person in town. And they would have to answer to her. She walked home with her groceries, each step feeling heavier than the last. The town's familiar streets stretched before her, the same sidewalks she had walked since childhood, the same storefronts, the same quiet neighborhood corners. But it didn't matter how long she had lived here. People still saw her as different, as someone who didn't belong. She had learned to brush off the stares, the whispers, the uncomfortable pauses in conversation when she walked into a room. But some days it was harder than others. Some days, the weight of it all settled deep into her bones, and she wondered if she would ever truly be accepted. By the time she reached her apartment, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a muted glow over the town. She set her bag down on the kitchen counter, exhaling slowly. She knew she should eat something, but her stomach felt knotted, tight with frustration. Instead, she sank onto the couch, rubbing her temples. Her phone vibrated beside her. She picked it up and saw the notification, a message from an old friend. She hesitated before opening it. "I heard about what happened at the store. Are you okay?" Word traveled fast in a town like this. She shouldn't have been surprised. She stared at the screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard. She could lie, say she was fine, pretend it didn't matter. But she was tired of pretending. "Not really," she typed back. "It's just exhausting, you know?" The reply came almost immediately. "I know. But listen, I was thinking, have you heard about the judge position opening up?" Her fingers stilled over the screen. She had heard about it. The town's longtime judge was retiring, and they were looking for a replacement. But she hadn't given it much thought. Why would she? People like her didn't get to hold positions like that. Not here. Her friend sent another message. "You should apply." She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Because they totally put someone like me in that position. Why not? You have the background, the experience." And maybe it's time for this town to see someone like you in a position of power. She stared at the message, her heart pounding in her chest. She did have the background. She had spent years studying law, working as a legal advocate, fighting for people who had been dismissed, ignored, cast aside. She knew the system, knew how to navigate it. But would they ever let her sit behind that bench? Would they ever let someone like her hold the gavel? Another message came through. Just think about it. She set the phone down, running a hand through her hair. The idea settled into her mind like a whisper, quiet but persistent. Maybe it was impossible. Maybe the town would fight her at every turn. But maybe, just maybe, this was exactly what she was meant to do. She didn't sleep much that night. Her mind raced with possibilities, doubts, hopes she didn't want to entertain but couldn't push away. By morning, she had made her decision. She was going to apply. And whether the town liked it or not, she was going to make them see her. The morning air was crisp as she sat at her desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The town's official application portal for the judge position was open on her screen, the blinking cursor waiting for her to take the first step. Her heart pounded in her chest. Was she really doing this? She had spent years advocating for people who had been dismissed, ignored, and mistreated, people like her. She knew the law, had studied every statute, every case that had shaped the town's judicial system. She was more than qualified. But qualifications didn't always matter. Not in a place like this. She could already hear the murmurs, the snide comments, the outright hostility. She could picture the sneers of the same people who whispered behind her back at the grocery store, the same ones who avoided eye contact at the town hall meetings. But then she thought about all the people in town who felt like she did. The ones who never got a fair shot, who were always being watched, always having to prove themselves. If she didn't do this, who would? She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and started typing. The application asked for basic information first: name, age, education. Simple. Then came the section on experience. Her fingers moved faster now, listing every case she had worked on, every policy change she had fought for, every community initiative she had led. The more she wrote, the more she realized just how much she had done, how much she had already contributed to this town, despite the way it treated her. Then came the final question. Why do you want to be the next judge of this town? She hesitated. A dozen polished, professional responses ran through her head, but none of them felt right. She didn't just want this position for her career. She wanted it because it was time. The days that followed felt like a slow, creeping storm. She knew that the moment her application was reviewed, people would start talking. And sure enough, the whispers started almost immediately. At first, it was just murmurs in the background, sideways glances when she walked into a cafe, hushed conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room. But then it became something more. She overheard a conversation at the grocery store, two older women standing near the produce aisle. "Did you hear?" one of them whispered. "She actually applied. She thinks they're going to let her sit on that bench?" the other scoffed. "She's not even." The woman caught sight of her standing just a few feet away and clamped her mouth shut. Her gaze locked onto them for a brief moment, and she saw it, the look in their eyes. Not just judgment. And that's when it hit her. They were afraid of change. Afraid of what it meant if someone like her could hold power. That thought kept her steady. She didn't flinch, didn't lower her head the way she once might have. Instead, she gave them a polite smile, turned, and walked away. Because no matter what they said, her name was already on that application. And nothing could erase that. By the end of the week, the rumors had spread like wildfire. She started getting unsolicited messages, some supportive, some cruel. One former colleague texted her, "I hope you get this. It's about time this town had someone who actually understands fairness." Another message, anonymous, "You don't belong here. Stop pretending you do." She refused to let the negativity shake her. Instead, she threw herself into preparation. She reviewed case law, memorized precedents, and practiced answering potential interview questions. She knew the selection process wouldn't be easy. There were other candidates, all of them men, all of them expected to be serious contenders. But she was ready. The official letter from the town's judicial committee arrived 2 weeks later. She held it in her hands, her fingers gripping the edges tightly. Taking a breath, she opened it. "Dear applicant, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected for an interview in the next round of the judicial appointment process." Her hands shook. She read the words again, then a third time. She had made it. They couldn't ignore her. No matter how much they whispered, no matter how many sideways glances she got, no matter how much they hoped she would back down, she was still here. She inhaled deeply, then reached for her phone. She had work to do. Because this wasn't just about getting an interview. This was about proving that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The morning of the interview arrived with an unsettling stillness. She had been preparing for weeks, but now that the moment was here, she could feel the weight of what it meant pressing against her chest. This wasn't just a job interview. This was a battle for legitimacy. She stepped into the courthouse, the old brick building standing tall like a relic of a past that had never welcomed people like her. The air inside was crisp, the scent of old paper and polished floors filling her lungs as she walked toward the waiting area. She wasn't alone. 3 other candidates were seated across the room, each of them men, all of them older, dressed in dark suits that exuded confidence and familiarity with spaces like this. They had always belonged here. She could feel their eyes on her. One of them, a man she recognized as a longtime local attorney, gave her a slow, deliberate once-over before leaning back in his chair. He didn't need to say anything. His expression spoke volumes. She straightened her posture, refusing to let her nerves show. She had worked too hard for this moment. A clerk stepped out from an office, scanning a clipboard. "Next, Miss Caldwell." She exhaled, stood, and walked forward. The interview panel was seated at a long table, 3 men and 2 women, all of them watching her closely. The room was bright, natural light spilling through tall windows, but it did nothing to soften the unspoken judgment in the air. One of the men cleared his throat. "Ms. Caldwell, thank you for being here. We've reviewed your application, and I must say, your experience is unconventional." There was the first shot. She clasped her hands together on the table, keeping her expression neutral. "If by unconventional you mean extensive work in legal advocacy and policy reform, then yes, my experience is different from the other candidates." One of the women on the panel, a middle-aged judge with a sharp gaze, tilted her head. "Your record does show strong community engagement. But you understand, this position requires a certain level of neutrality." Another test. Another implication. She met the woman's eyes. "I understand that justice isn't about neutrality, it's about fairness. And fairness requires recognizing when certain communities are disproportionately affected by legal decisions." The pause. A flicker of something in the woman's gaze. Approval? One of the men, older, stern, shifted in his seat. "Some in this town have expressed concerns about whether you can remain impartial. Given your background." She didn't blink. "I find it interesting that the same concern isn't raised about my competitors, even though they have political affiliations, business ties, and personal relationships with key figures in this town. If impartiality is the standard, then it should apply equally to all of us." Silence. One of the men scribbled something on his notepad. She wasn't here to beg for approval. She was here to prove she belonged. The questions continued, some sharp, some predictable. But she answered every single one with clarity, with confidence. By the time the interview ended, she could feel it, a shift. They hadn't expected her to be this prepared. She stood, shook hands, and walked out, her pulse steady. She didn't know what their final decision would be. But she knew one thing for sure. They couldn't ignore her now. The moment she stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of the interview still clung to her, but there was something else beneath it, a quiet certainty. She had done everything she could. She had walked into that room with the full knowledge that they would try to undermine her, question her legitimacy, make her feel small. And yet she had held her ground. Now all she could do was wait. The town, however, was not waiting. By the time she reached home, her phone was buzzing with notifications. Word had already spread. People knew she had made it to the final round. Some messages were supportive, hopeful. Others were less kind. One anonymous text read, "You're embarrassing yourself." No one wants you as judge." She exhaled slowly, refusing to let it sink under her skin. She had dealt with worse. The town's newspaper released an article that evening. The headline read, "Finalists for judge position announced, one candidate sparks controversy." She knew without even opening it that they were talking about her. She clicked on the article anyway. They had written an entire section about her unorthodox background and the divided reactions to her candidacy. Some members of the town praised her legal advocacy, while others, more vocal, more aggressive, argued that a judge needed to be a traditional representative of the community. She knew exactly what that meant. Not her. She set her phone down, rubbing her temples. The article wasn't surprising. The town had never fully accepted her, and now that she was on the verge of stepping into a position of power, the resistance was stronger than ever. And then, the interview tapes leaked. By morning, clips from her interview had made their way onto social media. The moment where she challenged the panel about bias in the selection process? It was everywhere. People were debating it in online forums, arguing in local Facebook groups. One comment caught her attention. "She's not wrong. Why is her background being questioned when the other candidates are just as involved in the town's politics?" Another was less kind. "This is a joke. We need a real judge, not a political statement." She sighed. She had expected this. What she hadn't expected was how many people were defending her. More and more voices were chiming in, challenging the unfair treatment she was receiving. Even people she had never spoken to before were speaking up. That evening, her phone rang. It was the head of the selection committee. She hesitated before answering, knowing that this call could determine everything. She pressed the phone to her ear. "Ms. Caldwell?" the voice on the other end said. "Yes?" There was a brief pause. "We'd like to discuss the next steps in the selection process." Her breath caught in her throat. They hadn't dismissed her. Despite the resistance, despite the backlash, she was still in the race. And if they thought she was going to back down now, they were dead wrong. She gripped the phone tightly, her pulse drumming in her ears. "The next steps," she echoed, keeping her voice even. "Yes," the head of the selection committee said. "We'll be conducting a final public forum. The town council wants to gauge community response before making an official decision." She exhaled slowly. Of course. A public forum. A chance for the town to weigh in, to scrutinize her, question her, tear her apart if they wanted to. They weren't just putting her through another interview, they were putting her on trial. And she had no doubt who would show up. Karen, the store employees, the same people who whispered behind her back, who smirked at her in checkout lines, who thought she was a threat simply by existing. But she also knew who else would be there. People who had been denied fairness. People who saw themselves in her fight. People who were tired of the same men in power making the same decisions over and over again. She straightened her shoulders. "When is it?" "Friday evening. Town hall." The pause. "We expect a full house." She didn't doubt it. "Understood," she said, her voice steady. "I'll be there." When she hung up, she let herself breathe for a moment. Then she started preparing. For 3 days, she studied every possible attack, every criticism, every loophole they might try to use against her. She crafted responses, rehearsed arguments, sharpened her words like a blade. She would not be caught off guard. By the time Friday arrived, she was ready. The town hall was packed, just as expected. Rows of seats filled with familiar and unfamiliar faces, people craning their necks to get a good look at her as she entered. She spotted Maya, Jason, her former colleagues, even the cafe owner who had always supported her. And, of course, Karen was there too, sitting in the front row, arms crossed. She took her seat at the long table at the front of the room, across from the selection committee. The head councilman cleared his throat. "Ms. Caldwell, thank you for being here tonight. As you know, the purpose of this forum is to hear community concerns regarding your potential appointment." "Concerns?" He gestured toward the audience. "We'll open the floor for comments now." The first speaker was an older man in a suit. A lawyer. One of the other candidates. "I just want to say," he began, his voice dripping with politeness masking condescension, "that I respect Ms. Caldwell's experience, But we must consider whether her personal background makes it difficult for her to remain impartial. There was. She leaned forward. What exactly about my background do you think makes me incapable of impartiality? The man faltered. Well, your history of advocacy. For fairness under the law, she interrupted. Murmurs in the crowd. The lawyer cleared his throat. It's just that a judge must uphold neutrality. She met his gaze. Neutrality does not mean ignoring who is disproportionately affected by legal decisions. Neutrality means ensuring that the law applies fairly to everyone, regardless of who they are. More murmurs. The next person stepped up. A woman in her 40s. I don't know if we're ready for this kind of change. That word again. Change. She didn't flinch. The law does not wait for a town to be ready. The law serves the people. All of them. A few claps from the back of the room. The forum continued, question after question, challenge after challenge. Some people were openly hostile, others simply skeptical. But for every voice trying to push her out, there were just as many speaking up for her. By the end of the night, the energy in the room had shifted. She had stood her ground. And they couldn't ignore her anymore. The tension in the town hall was still thick as the final speaker took their seat. The selection committee exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. But she could feel the shift in the room. The people who had come expecting her to stumble, to break, to falter under pressure, they had been disappointed. She had answered every question with clarity, every challenge with conviction. And the town had seen it. The head councilman cleared his throat, signaling the end of the forum. Thank you, Ms. Caldwell, for your time tonight. We will be deliberating and making our decision public next week. She nodded, standing up as quiet murmurs filled the air. The walk out of the town hall felt like the longest of her life. She could feel Karen's eyes on her, the glares from the ones who didn't want her here. But she also heard whispers of support. She held her own. She's more qualified than half of them. She could actually change things. By the time she stepped outside, the cool night air hit her face, fresh, freeing. She had done what she came to do. Now, she just had to wait. The next week dragged on like a slow countdown. The town couldn't stop talking. Everyone had an opinion. Local newspapers ran headlines. Final decision nears. Will the town elect its first transgender judge? Social media was on fire. Some people supported her, others were outraged. Some called it progress, others called it an agenda. But she stayed steady. She went about her days as usual, waiting for the decision she had no control over anymore. Then, the email came. She stared at it for a long moment before clicking it open. Dear Ms. Caldwell, after careful deliberation, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as the town's next judge. Her breath hitched. She read the words again, slowly, making sure she hadn't imagined them. Then she exhaled. They had chosen her. Despite the pushback. Despite the whispers. Despite people like Karen. She had won. Her phone vibrated with messages. People were already finding out. Some friends, old colleagues, even strangers were reaching out. One text stood out. They tried to shut you out. And now they have to stand before you. A slow smile curled on her lips. Because it was true. People who had mocked her, dismissed her, tried to push her away, they would have to stand in her courtroom now. And when they did, they wouldn't be able to ignore her. Not anymore. She straightened her shoulders, took one last deep breath, and closed the email. This town had never truly seen her before. But now, they had no choice. The news spread faster than she anticipated. Within hours, her name was everywhere. Social media posts flooded in, some celebrating, others furious. The town's main newspaper put out an article with the headline, Town appoints first transgender judge, a historic moment or a controversial decision? She knew what that meant. They were already framing her appointment as a debate, as if fairness, qualifications, and justice were up for discussion, as if she had to prove herself all over again. But she wasn't afraid anymore. That night, her phone didn't stop buzzing. Messages from friends, mentors, former colleagues, some people she hadn't heard from in years. One text stood out. Elena, they're already talking about overturning the decision. Be ready. She exhaled slowly. Of course they were. The next morning, she walked into the courthouse for the first time as a judge. And there, standing right at the entrance, was Karen. Arms crossed, lips pursed, eyes full of disbelief and anger. She didn't say a word. But she didn't have to. Everything about her posture screamed, "You don't belong here." She met Karen's stare head-on. Unwavering. Then she walked past her, not sparing another glance. Because this was her courthouse now. The first day was full of formalities, meetings with clerks, discussions with other officials, the weight of so many eyes watching, waiting for her to slip up. But she didn't. She walked into her chambers, sat down at her desk, and let reality sink in. She had spent years fighting for fairness, for dignity, for recognition. And now, she had the power to deliver it. The door opened slightly, and one of the clerks peeked in. "Your Honor," she said hesitantly. "Your first case is ready." Her heart thumped once. She smoothed her hands over her robe, stood, and stepped into the courtroom. The murmurs quieted. The lawyers, the defendants, the spectators, they all turned to look at her. She took her seat at the bench, hands steady, gaze unwavering. Then she spoke. "This court is now in session." And just like that, it was real. She wasn't a debate. She wasn't a controversy. She was Judge Caldwell. And whether the town liked it or not, she was here to stay. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the moment pressing into the air. She had spent years preparing for this, but now, sitting in the judge's chair, she finally felt the power shift. She scanned the room, taking in the expressions before her. Some people avoided her gaze. Others studied her, waiting to see if she would falter, if she was as capable as her title now demanded. She wasn't here to convince them. She was here to do her job. The first case was a minor dispute, a landlord-tenant disagreement over repairs. Standard procedure. The attorneys presented their arguments, the claimants gave their statements, and she listened carefully, methodically. She ruled fairly, citing legal precedent, making her decision crystal clear. And just like that, the first ruling from Judge Caldwell was made. But outside the courthouse, the resistance was growing. By the afternoon, a crowd had gathered. A handful of protesters held signs. Some were vague, "We deserve a fair judge," but others were far more direct. "This is an attack on our town." She stepped outside, feeling the tension crackling in the air. The reporters were already there, microphones and cameras waiting, eager for a statement. She didn't flinch. One reporter stepped forward. "Judge Caldwell, how do you respond to those who say you're not fit for this position?" She met the reporter's gaze without hesitation. "The law is clear. My qualifications speak for themselves. My job is to uphold justice fairly and impartially. That's exactly what I intend to do." Another reporter asked, "What do you say to the people who believe this is political?" She tilted her head slightly. "The law isn't political. Fairness isn't political. But change? Change makes people uncomfortable. And that's what we're seeing." The murmurs in the crowd grew. She turned, walking back into the courthouse, head held high. Let them talk. Let them protest. She wasn't going anywhere. That evening, her inbox was flooded with emails, some congratulating her, some condemning her. One message stood out. It was from a young law student. "You give me hope. Thank you for showing me that people like us can be more than a debate. We can lead." She exhaled, her chest tightening, not with fear, but with certainty. Because for every Karen, for every critic, for every protester demanding that she step down, there were people who saw her and finally believed they could take up space too. And that made all of this worth it. The next few weeks were a test. Every day, she walked into the courthouse knowing that people were waiting for her to fail, waiting for her to slip up, waiting for any excuse to say, "I told you so." But she didn't give them one. She handled every case with precision, with fairness, with an unwavering sense of duty. When a business owner tried to evict a tenant without cause, she ruled in favor of the tenant. The law was clear. When a wealthy man tried to intimidate a small business into a bad deal, she didn't bend. Justice wasn't for sale. And when Karen, yes, the same Karen who had called the cops on her in the grocery store, came to her courtroom demanding that her property dispute be ruled in her favor. She treated her like any other citizen. No bias. No retaliation. Just justice. Karen refused to make eye contact with her when the ruling was delivered. But the rest of the town was watching. The protesters still showed up outside the courthouse, but their numbers were dwindling. The people who had once called her appointment a mistake were realizing that she wasn't going anywhere. And then, one morning, a letter arrived on her desk. It was from a retired judge, a man who had served in the same courthouse for decades. She opened it carefully, unsure of what to expect. "Judge Caldwell," it began. "I'll be honest. When I first heard you had been appointed, I wasn't sure what to think. I have spent my life believing that judges should come from a certain background, a certain tradition. But I have watched you these past few weeks. And what I see is someone who understands the law, who understands fairness, and who carries the weight of this position with grace. This town has never been good at embracing change. But change is here, and I'm glad you're the one leading it." She set the letter down, taking a slow breath. For so long, she had been fighting just to exist in this town, to be seen, to be taken seriously. But now, she wasn't just existing. She was leading. She was making history. And no one, not Karen, not the protesters, not the ones who whispered in grocery store aisles, could take that away from her. She belonged here. And she always had. The realization settled deep in her chest. She had won. Not just the position. Not just the title of Judge Caldwell. She had won the right to exist without question, to stand in a place that had been built to keep people like her out. And now, every time she stepped into the courtroom, she was a reminder that the world had changed, whether they liked it or not. The courthouse doors no longer felt like a barrier. They were hers to walk through. As the weeks passed, the protests outside dwindled, replaced by a quiet acceptance. People who once sneered at her now stood before her bench, addressing her with respect, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. And Karen? She hadn't been seen in weeks. Until one afternoon. She stepped into the courtroom not as a protester, not as a judge of character, but as a plaintiff. She was filing a lawsuit against a neighbor over a property dispute. Karen, who had once tried to erase her, now had to stand before her and ask for justice. Karen's face was tight with discomfort as she took the stand, her voice clipped, her hands gripping the edge of the podium. She wouldn't look up, wouldn't acknowledge who was presiding over her case. But she didn't have to. The irony was already thick in the air. The woman who had once called the police on her for simply existing in public now had to rely on her to rule fairly. And she did. Because she wasn't like Karen. She didn't rule based on prejudice or ego. She ruled based on the law. And when she handed down the decision, when Karen had no choice but to accept it, the shift was complete. Karen left without a word. No apology. No acknowledgement. But it didn't matter. The victory wasn't in forcing people like Karen to change their minds. The victory was in making sure that their opinions didn't matter anymore. By the time she removed her robe that evening, she knew the battle she had fought for so long was over. She had nothing left to prove. She belonged here. And she always would. The weight of the moment settled over her as she sat in her chambers, the courthouse quiet now, the echoes of the day fading into stillness. Karen had left without looking back, but the reality of what had happened would never leave her. For so long, people like Karen had controlled the narrative. Who was deserving? Who was qualified? Who belonged? But now, Karen had stood in front of her bench, had been forced to address her as Your Honor, had to rely on the very system she once thought should exclude her. And she had delivered justice, not with revenge, not with bias, but with fairness. That was the difference. People like Karen had tried to erase her. She had simply risen above them. She ran a hand over the polished wood of her desk, exhaling. It was over. The fight for recognition, for legitimacy, it had been won. Not because they had all changed their minds, but because their opinions no longer had the power to change her fate. The courthouse doors opened, and a clerk peeked in. "Judge Caldwell?" She looked up. "Yes? There's someone here to see you." She frowned slightly, standing. When she stepped into the hall, she stopped. A young woman, early 20s, nervous, shifting from foot to foot. She looked up and smiled, hesitant but hopeful. "I just wanted to say, thank you," the young woman said, her voice quiet but firm. "For proving that someone like us can be here." Her breath caught. Someone like us. The fight had never been just for herself. It had been for everyone who had been told they weren't enough, weren't worthy, weren't meant to exist in spaces of power. And now they had proof that they could. She smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "You'll be here too one day," she said softly. The young woman's eyes lit up, because now she believed it. And that was the real victory.